Okay, good day to you all and friends. My name is Chen Lu. I'm from the Friends of Multilateralism Group. Just a story about me and agriculture to kickstart a discussion, more fun later on with Stuart and others. Now, I was representing China, negotiating agriculture for quite some years. Shortly after China's accession to the WTO. My memories of that time was quite a lot of fun. We were discussing export subsidies, different boxes of different colors, market access, sensitive products, special products, linear formula to cut tariffs, so on and so forth. But now the things are different. I think agriculture seemed to have been missing from quite a few ministerial conferences. So that's quite alarming. So that's why we decided that we will organize this meeting. Of course, we have done the other one, previous one, on services, which is also a missed item from WTO discussions. So without further ado, I will just give floor to Stuart and to kickstart of this important subject. Stuart, to you. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Lou. And I'd like to say good morning, good afternoon, good evening to participants who I'm sure are tuning in from a variety of locations. And welcome to our session on agriculture. It's actually 25 years since negotiations were launched in the WTO under the built-in agenda of the Uruguay round on agriculture, in accordance with Article 20, of course, of the agreement. And as you know, this article refers to the continuation of the reform process, recognizing the long-term objective of substantial progressive reductions in support and protection. Initially, and I remember this at the time, there was zero traction in the negotiations which were launched in 2000. And a lot of those who were involved drew the conclusion that a broader canvas was needed in order to provide some scope for trade-offs. And as a result, it's actually no exaggeration at all to say that agriculture launched the Doha round. The Doha mandate on agriculture was predicated on the rapid agreement of so-called modalities, and this infamous term, modalities, was not fine. The general idea, I think, at the time was that there should be a set of intermediate guidelines which would set up the detailed negotiations on a final outcome. But in the event, the search for modalities resulted in a level of ever-increasing detail, so that it seemed to become a direct negotiation of the final outcome of the round without any intermediate step. I think looking back at the tortuous, or some would say torturous, history of Doha, it's tempting to think that members collectively never got to the stage of actually wanting to conclude negotiations on agriculture. It always seemed to be easier to put the decision off by saying that the modalities needed to address yet another level of detail. One thing, however, has been constant throughout, and that is that there's always been intense engagement on agriculture, and that remains the case. But some would say perhaps there's been more activity than action. Having said that, there have been some very notable achievements. For example, the commitment at Nairobi Ministerial Conference in 2015 to abolish export subsidies for farm exports, which I remember the Director General at the time hailed as the most significant outcome on agriculture in the WTO's history. More recently, we did have outcomes at MC12 in the form of a declaration on the emergency response to food insecurity and on exempting World Food Programme purchases from export prohibitions and restrictions. And I saw that just last month, the Committee on Agriculture actually adopted a report with recommendations on how to help LDCs and NFIDCs respond to food insecurity. These outcomes, these later outcomes, are not perhaps earth-shattering, but they do seem to indicate a willingness on the part of members to address at least some of the present-day challenges to the extent possible. However, as Lou said, on the core of the negotiations, we again drew a blank at MC13 as regards concrete outcomes. This is very disappointing, certainly, but also not, I'm sure, for want of effort. And I note that the hardworking chair of the negotiations, who has incidentally, my heartfelt support and sympathy, I must say, said that the absence of results did not mean that there had been no progress. Some of the texts that are on the table presently focus on the objectives for MC14. For example, whether to agree modalities by then, or to agree what's called a balanced package by then, or merely to work towards achieving such a balanced package. There's also disagreement over the sequencing of any potential results. There's no doubt, I would have to say, that the negotiations are taking place against a very difficult and rapidly changing economic and political background. Major challenges such as food security and the need for sustainability have moved to center stage, and negotiators are adapting to new realities. On the surface, then, the situation is becoming ever more complicated as the members cast around for the key to unlock the talks. No wonder, then, that the chair has recently issued an appeal for fresh thinking. We hope today to respond in a very modest way to that appeal. And to do so, we're very fortunate to have three extremely knowledgeable panelists who will give us the benefit of their outlook on the state of the negotiations. I won't go into detail because their bios are in the program notes, but very briefly, Kevin Rogerson has long experience, of course, at senior levels of the WTO Secretariat, both in agriculture and the councils and TNC divisions. So he's been up close and personal, you might say, with the negotiations for many years. Carmel Cahill is a former Deputy Director at the OECD's Trade and Agriculture Directorate, where, amongst other things, she led an international team of economists and analysts on food and agriculture policy. And I'm sure we're all in the WTO very well aware and appreciate the OECD's valuable intellectual input in this area over the years. And Valeria Pineiro is head of the Latin America and Caribbean region in the Markets, Trade and Institutions Unit of the International Food Research Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. The work in the region includes development strategies, economic growth, and trade policies. On behalf of the FMG, let me thank the panelists for agreeing to be with us today to lead the discussion at this event. I'm going to, in the customary way, I'm going to give them each of them the floor for an introductory intervention, and then we'll have a short discussion. And hopefully this will allow enough time, and I think we should try to allow a lot of time for comments and questions from the audience. And of course, these can come either through the raise hand function or the chat box. Finally, just a reminder that as Lou mentioned, the session is being recorded, and a link to the video will be put later on the FMG website. So with those few introductory words, could I turn first to you, Evan, and ask you to make your preliminary remarks?
Okey-dokey. Thanks, Stuart. We've got about 10 minutes each, right?
Yes, that would be great.
Okey-dokey. Well, welcome to everybody, old friends, new friends, others. And in thinking about this session, I was reminded of the story of the guy who's driving around out in the countryside, looking for somewhere. He can't find the place he's looking for. He's lost. And eventually he pulls up alongside an old farmer who's working out in the fields, and he asks him if he can give him directions to the place he wants to go to. And the farmer ponders for a bit and then says, well, if I were you, I wouldn't start from here. And that seemed to me to have a certain application to the WTO ag negotiations. There's no denying that the negotiations are having trouble finding their way, and there's not even a lot of agreement on where they should be going. Stuart said that we've only got limited progress to show for more than 20 years of hard work by chairs, negotiators, and the Secretariat, to whom I give a big shout out. The negotiations, frankly, seem to be a kind of endless loop where entrenched positions get played over and over again. And if you were starting from scratch, this is not what anyone would choose. But of course, we're not starting from scratch. We can't. I don't think any members see it as desirable or realistic to turn the clock back to zero. So, like the guy in my story, we do have to start from here. How to do that's the big question, of course. I don't pretend to have any answers. These would have to be negotiated in any case. But I do hope that this discussion can highlight some questions and suggest some maybe things to think about further. I'd also like to acknowledge the efforts that various delegations are making in this respect already, like the recent submission from Brazil. I'm not going to get into the details of different positions or take sides or say who's right or wrong here. One of the luxuries of being retired is that I can take a bit of a helicopter view of things, and that's what I'm going to try and do. When I worked with successive General Council chairs preparing ministerial conferences, the most useful technique we used was what we called incremental convergence, which simply means that you start by finding out the things on which all or most members can converge, even though those elements might seem very basic, rather banal, general, or obvious. You know, very much motherhood and apple pie things, but you start by identifying those and then try and build up from that through successive rounds of consultation till eventually you have something perhaps that pushes the negotiation or the WTO's business ahead a little bit. I'm not telling experienced negotiators anything they don't know, but I'm bringing this up because I think it might be useful for participants in these negotiations to remind themselves of the basic elements on which you can all presumably converge. These are two of my favorite words, elements and converge. Some of these are set out in the preamble to the chair's text of 29 February. Personally, I'd like to see more emphasis on climate change, but that's not up to me. There's often a tendency to skip over preambular language, but I suggest that these points are very important because they underline why these negotiations are vital, not just to the WTO, but also to our world as a whole. Agricultural trade will only become more important in tackling hunger and poverty and in promoting development and sustainability. These are the only global negotiations on agricultural trade. Another basic thing that perhaps we ought to remind ourselves about. There is no, unless I've missed something, there is no competing global negotiation on agricultural trade. And I can't imagine anybody starting another one up in the near future. So they're the only ones we've got, and imperfect and frustrating though they certainly are, the world needs them. The basic mandate for these negotiations, as Stuart said, goes back 30 years to Article 20 of the Agreement on Agriculture. I reflect on how ancient I'm getting, that I was around for that too, in a junior way. The mandate's of course been added to by decisions of ministerial conferences and general council since then. And it's got a certain depth to it now. I don't believe there's any enthusiasm for renegotiating the mandate, which would be, in my opinion, a pretty foolish undertaking. The challenge instead is to work creatively within it to deliver results that are positive and meaningful for the global community. The mandate's a launching pad, not a final destination. It seems to me, without getting into whose negotiating positions, right or wrong, which people tend to do, I see two general factors that are impeding the negotiation that affect everybody. The first is the lack of positive linkages, both internal and external. Stuart touched on this when he mentioned that agriculture was always seen as difficult, if not impossible, to negotiate on its own, and that, rightly or wrongly, governments decided around the turn of the century that they had to construct around to provide the sort of synergies to get agriculture moving. It probably wasn't quite that simple, but that was certainly an element of it. And because it was always taken as an article of faith that you couldn't negotiate agriculture on its own, you needed the sort of trade-offs with other negotiating areas. In the Uruguay round, for example, this was services, it was intellectual property. And at the same time, in agriculture now, we don't, it seems to me, have any very powerful coalition of political forces or of forces outside the negotiation, outside Geneva, pushing it forward. In fact, the forces outside, the various interest groups who watch the negotiations, tend to be as divided as the national negotiating positions. So there isn't the sort of coalition of political and public energy pushing it forward as there was at times in the Uruguay round. And of course, as Stuart mentioned, the broader geopolitical environment is difficult for the multilateral trading system, among other things. This is beyond our scope to fix here, but I would suggest that at least we should be aiming to get the negotiations into shape to take advantage of any improvement in the geopolitical scene. The older hands here will recall that the Uruguay round ag negotiations were unblocked by a deal between the EU and the US after a period of stagnation. We can always hope for similar deals, similar breakthroughs here, although of course it would have to be between more participants than just two. Maybe greater convergence in agriculture can make a small but significant contribution to showing that international cooperation still has some life in it. So the sort of trade-offs with other WTO negotiations that helped power the previous negotiations whether with NAMA, services, whatever, are unlikely to come back. I mean, we have to face it that the rest of the round is pretty much dead. Not officially, but, you know, in practice. And there are not going to be the sort of linkages available to help power agriculture from the outside from other WTO negotiations. If ag's going anywhere, it's going alone. But is it going alone, I ask you? Only in very narrow WTO terms. If you step back and look at these negotiations in a broader global context, it looks very different. Maybe a bit more hopeful and certainly a lot more urgent. Whatever its situation in the WTO, agricultural trade is vital to livelihoods, sustainability, food security, coping with the effects of climate change, to name but a few. These are literally matters of life and death. Recentering the negotiations in the context of these sorts of global priorities may help bring some new energy to them and increase their profile in a helpful way. This could also mean looking at the existing negotiating structure in new ways. The vertical pillars, domestic support, market access, etc., are no doubt with us to stay. They have an ancient history. They are kind of, you know, a bit like ancient Roman pillars and equally battered. And they are often, I think, rather limiting. Zoom is just telling me that I might have switched to a different language. Please tell me if I have. I don't think I have. Anyhow, the pillars, I think, perhaps are a bit of a limiting factor in many ways, but we are stuck with them, though they are increasingly like silos, and we're not getting much in the way of positive synergies among them. We're not seeing positive trade-offs between market access and domestic support. Quite the reverse. It's a source of blockage mostly. So why not try to take a more horizontal, cross-cutting view across the subjects, across the pillars? For example, look at key issues across pillars. Try to bring together elements that help address, for example, climate change, sustainability, food security, nutrition, horizontally across the traditional pillars. I think this might help get a new set of perspectives and hopefully a more productive one. It could also help to bring or strengthen new energy from outside the WTO to boost support for the negotiations. If the WTO negotiations were seen as a force for making a positive difference on issues of global concern, not just as some endless and increasingly irrelevant rerun of old battles, we might find that there was more public and political urge to get them done. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Evan. That's marvelous. And well, you touched on a huge number of very important issues like climate change and the need for linkages, coalitions of forces, recentering the negotiations and a horizontal approach, and a whole lot more. I'm sure we'll come back to a lot of these issues later in the session. But for the moment, can I thank you very much for that input and ask the floor to Carmel. Carmel, please.
Thank you, Stuart, and good afternoon to everybody. I could say the usual polite thing about how it's a pleasure to be here, but ever since I agreed to do this, I've been regretting it and feeling like a total imposter. And now that I see the list of all the illustrious people who are here, I'm feeling even more so. But anyway, I'll have a go. when you're retired, I was just listening to the radio at lunchtime and I heard a lady say in respect of something else, she said, il faut pas avoir peur d'être naïve, meaning you shouldn't be afraid to be naive. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm probably going to be very naive. But the task, Stuart, that you have given us is a difficult one. The outcome from MC13 looks, at least superficially to those of us on the outside, to be just about the worst that there's been ever. As far as I can tell from the documentation that's available to me, every possible technical solution, partial or comprehensive, reasonable or unreasonable, has at some level or another already been on the table and been rejected. I think nobody is being swayed anymore by, economic analysis that tells us that there are lots of benefits to be had, even if you move unilaterally, and even more so if you move multilaterally and across a broad swathe of sectors. But nobody is really paying much attention to any of that, and neither do people seem to be motivated by the fact that agriculture is increasingly becoming one of those areas that is posing a very serious threat to the reputation and even the existence of the WTO. So much for the very negative background. I'm going to have a go nonetheless at seeing whether there's anything that could be said that might change minds and hearts on some of the issue. I'm going to talk mainly about domestic support. And a bit like Evan, I think that a somewhat neglected issue where there might be some gains to be made concerns the whole issue of trade reform and sustainability. Back in the days, the agreement on agriculture was based on a lot of economic analysis that suggested a hierarchy of measures that were most production and trade distorting. If you look at the literature today, you will see that there's a whole new literature there that confirms pretty much the same hierarchy in respect of environmental damage and climate change. So that suggests that there are some pretty important win-win or win-win-win solutions that might be out there where trade reform could be good for climate and good for environmental performance. So it seems to me, looking again in from the outside, that moving to put a stop, or at least to put a brake on measures that, to the fact that the most distorting measures, which are variable input subsidies, are hardly at all disciplined under current disciplines. That might be one area to look and would be a big gain for, I think, across the board. Another issue would be maybe to look explicitly at the green box and see whether something could be done there. There's no mention whatsoever of climate change anywhere in the agreement on agriculture, I think. Would it be possible to write in some positive encouragement for climate change measures in the green box? Would it be possible to move away from the current provision that allows payments only to compensate for extra costs or income foregone in terms of environment, and actually allow incentive payments to be made? Could we explicitly allow for on-farm investments for new climate change or environmental performance technologies, that kind of thing? So some kind of down in the weeds, concrete suggestions for things that could be done to pursue trade reform and sustainability. On food security, well, the question of public stock holding is obviously a very vexed one. I tend to favor the technical solution, which says that procurement prices or administered prices used, unless those procurement prices are higher than some measurement of current or as near to current as possible international world market prices, that we should not consider that there's any issue. But I realize that that creates concerns for countries who see that as a carte blanche for completely unlimited market price support in some respects. So maybe there's a possibility to think of that technical solution, but of somehow constraining that technical solution. For example, by making it time limited and reverting to the original rules if in a certain amount of time a more comprehensive agreement was not found. Could you imagine saying, yes, we'll agree to this technical change, but you can be challenged if you set your prices more than X% above international reference prices? Could you prohibit exports from food security stocks in the countries concerned? Maybe there's some way to break the deadlock on that. I think these issues are very urgent, and in particular on the climate and environment side, because countries are pursuing policies that are actually exacerbating the problems. And maybe one day there will be a major catastrophe, which will have been in part caused by those policies related to a drought, related to the spreading of a disease or something like that. So I think it's urgent to ask to move. A few years ago, I, with Stefan, presented something called the Pathways Project. We presented it to this group, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago. I'm not going to bore you with repeating all of the details of that, but in terms of thinking about what a comprehensive agreement might look like that preserves the architecture of the original agreement, but at some level starts from scratch. I think I can give you a list of what I and what the Pathways Group thought that might look like. Clearly, it should be holistic, covering all the pillars, including export restrictions. Very important point, it should be based on current parameters. So this is the issue about the near absurdity of working off indicators that use a 40-year-old, now an almost 40-year-old reference price, which bears no reality to economic to the economic circumstances of today. We thought that an agreement should use only terms and variables that are defined and can be verified. That all rules should require more effort from those who have the highest starting levels of whatever the indicator is, support and protection, and that all indicators should be relative, meaning measured relative to something like value of production. We also had a thorough look at other aspects of the Green Box and suggested that the range of things covered under the direct payments provisions should be narrowed. I'm adding that just so that I can vex absolutely everybody and not just some of you with these kinds of ideas. So I can hear you kind of saying now, well, there's not much political reality in all of that, and you might be right. But if you were to put together a comprehensive agreement that had some of those elements or all of those elements to it, it is my I'm really convinced that by doing so, you would eliminate the grievances, you'd real or perceived, you would remove loopholes, you would be working from a basis that actually corresponds to the economic realities. You would hugely simplify, you'd remove a lot of ambiguities. So as nobody has decided to do this yet, I have a suggestion to make, which is that the resources be found to put together some kind of a task force. It could be made up of experts from delegations, members of the WTO Secretariat, experts from international organizations that would actually put together all the data needed using the current parameters. That's the most important thing. And build a kind of a model, it could be just a spreadsheet or some kind of template that would allow countries to test scenarios. I think a lot of this technical work has been done already in the context of the proposals that are on the table most recently, with the important difference that it would use current data. I think that if you did something like that, that countries could then come to the table knowing exactly where they stood and what the implications would be if they moved in this or that or the other direction. It would tell us something about where it would make sense to place the cursor, if I could put it like that. What is the level below which we wouldn't necessarily be asking countries to do anything, above which countries would need to move, and what the depth of what they would need to do would be. So I think it could provide an awful lot of clarity if something like this was done. But as I said, what I heard on the radio at lunchtime, you mustn't be afraid of being naive, but that's the thought that I have today. If none of this can happen, it seems to me we have to start thinking about something less than multilateral. I think that can be maybe the only option for going forward. And in that context, and my thoughts are not very, very well developed on this, but it seems to me that we might want to re-examine the proposition that you can't do domestic support outside of the multilateral environment, because maybe there are some things you can do, and maybe some of the things that you could do might be in respect to that bunch of things that I'm calling sustainability. And maybe we'll get back to talking a little bit more about that, and some of the people listening might have some thoughts about it that are more developed than I have. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Carmen. That's marvelous as well. I mean, you know, you touched on a lot of great ideas there, and I don't think you're being naive at all. I mean, you know, we're asked to come up with fresh thinking, and that's exactly what you've done. So no apology is required in that respect. I do assure you. Can I turn straight away to Valeria now? And Valeria, could you make your initial remarks? Thanks. Hi, Valeria, are you there?
I am. Yeah. I had an issue. Well, good morning. I should say good afternoon to most of you, and thank you so much to you, Stuart, and everybody else from the Friends of Multilateralism to invite me here. It's really a pleasure to be around all of you. Some new faces and some not so new. So my presentation, I think that it will be a little bit different, and I think that hopefully complements quite a lot with Evans and Carmel. It will be some repetition, but hopefully some new ideas as well. So for me, from where I come from, it is more than just convince people of the advantage of multilateralism. For me, it's also how to prove or show the advantages of trade in itself. So I think that we all agree on that sustainability. So I think that that could be our starting point. We all agree that from the three pillars of sustainability, economic, social, and environmental are things that we all care about and that they are important. And we also agree that there is a nexus between the three pillars that we can see in poverty, food security, and climate change. And on top of that, I think that we can all agree, or at least discuss, the advantage of the role of trade in providing those nexus. Because there's always trade-offs when you try to, you have a policy, you have one objective, but in reality, you have these trade-offs between the economic, the social, and the environmental. So the role of trade could be also seen more than anything in growth. If you look at the economic pillar, diversity when we see the social, and then obviously we have a mitigation strategy for climate change if needed. So I think that that's how it goes. So for that, I'm sorry, but I have a presentation, so I will share my screen and hopefully we all see it. Can you all see it? Yes, perfect. Thank you so much for letting me know. So for this, I would like to, today, what I would like to show, or at least highlight, is some of the context that we have from this book that we published with ICA, so it's IFPRI, and IICA, that we had like a preview of the book at the MC13. So it was a hybrid event, but it was a closed event. We will have the actual presentation of the book, I think, that the first week of July. So before I start with that, I just wanted to highlight that this is a work done by many, many different authors from the region. This has the perspective of Latin America and the Caribbean, but maybe we can learn, or we can also get something from developing countries. So again, this is all the authors, which I thank them very much, and I edited with Martin Pineiro as well. So just to highlight some of the things that we have, and I think that Evan and Carmel already pointed out many of these things. But what we try to see, again, thinking about this sustainability. So there are many themes that have been the center of the discussion for some time at the WTO. And they appear to have persistent and long-term importance, no? So the reduction of subsidies that Carmen just discussed, market distortions that provide unfair advantages to some producers over others, and distort global trade. So this discussion of reorientation or some or repurposing or redistribution of subsidies is related to this issue and has been discussed. The other one that has been discussed quite a lot is how we can improve global food security through trade regulations that enhance and protect local food supplies in net food importing countries, but that also creates trade opportunities for net food exporting countries. And then the third one is how can we address the non-trade concerns such as environmental sustainability, animal welfare, food safety standards, and other ones, establishing norms that can address these concerns that otherwise will create trade barriers. And then there are some new issues that arise from obviously the changing in technological changes and also the geopolitical context that actually Evan pointed out on that as well. So that there are two overarching themes that that seems to be relevant for this challenging for agricultural trade, which is one is the trade and technological tensions that I just mentioned. And then the other one is the supply chain resilience and security. There has been recent disruption in global supply chains, not only from the pandemic, but also related with logistics when we looked at Canal Suez and some other issues, but also Panama Canal that it was related with climate change. So these are things in logistics that are creating also some issues as that. That could be also new opportunities for discussing. And then just to put it in context that you all know this, but I think I have nice figures, so why not mentioning them? But so cultural trade has experienced a slight increase as a proportion of total trade over the past 15 years, suggesting that there's greater stability in food demand and the trade needs resulting from this demand. Even in situations of economic stability, such as the ones that we experienced in recent years. So the left and bottom graph show the major regions of the world according to their position as net exporters or net importers. They vary significant role depending on the Western Hemisphere, Brazil, United States, and then the position of net importers in Asia, Middle East, and North Africa that can be seen in that graph. But then the ones on the right, what they really show is we kind of group them depending on the overall political alliance. And so we can really see on those that if we see the one on top are the net, is the Western Hemisphere, that they are really net food exporters compared to the one on the bottom that it is more group led by China, but also with Russia, that they are net food importers. So this can be a way also of this creates really 3 main areas of work that seem kind of important, at least what we thought. The first one will be that there is really the need for distorting subsidies to achieve more sustainable and efficient agricultural production, that will require geographic reallocation and investment in appropriate technologies in regions with natural resources, that they are abundant in natural resources. The second one is really the need to establish policies on public stock holdings to address the uncertainties in global trade, especially related to the geopolitical landscape and the logistical disruptions in supply chains that I already mentioned. But then the third one, last one, will be that developing framework for bilateral and plurilateral trade agreements. That also Carmel mentioned something really with this. This will be very important to address, or at least to discuss. So another chapter that we had in this book is just a recopilation of some of the of one webinar that we organized, IFPRI organized with IISD last year. Again, trying to highlight what were the most important topics going into MC13, or at least the ones that we thought that for the delegates and people in the capital were really keen to know about. And we highlighted domestic support, PSH, and export restrictions. And then this is a chapter that actually Joseph Glover wrote on PSH, public stock holdings. And I think that I would just like to highlight a couple of things that, again, Carmel actually really pointed out as well. That it seems that for PSH, there could be a technical problem, but also an exception issue. So if we look at the technical problem, it's really about the fixed external reference price, that it is based right now in the 86-88 period, and how that will be modified or not. So the technical solution will be to update to a more recent period or based on a moving average of prices. But then there is also a discussion, or at least a question, is if that correction applies to all AMS or just PSH. So that will be another one. And then we have the exception problem, in which the same thing applies. It should PSH support be exempt from AMS disciplines or not, the concerns for programs where PSH support distorts production and trade, and the need for recourse against possible adverse trade effects of PSH problems. This table that Joe put presents the characteristic of selected PSH programs for which members have reported market price support and expenditure under Annex 2. And then what it shows is that in recent years, China's stocks for wheat, rice, and corn are quite large compared to other programs, represented over 75% of China's maize and rice production, and over 100% for wheat. And also it shows that India's stocks of wheat and rice as a percentage of their domestic production average around 17 to 27%. So as a percentage of global stocks, rice accounted for approximately 19%, while its wheat stocks is less than 7% in the global wheat markets. And then the chapter we have on domestic support, what we really look was the agricultural subsidies really remain concentrated in just a few countries and products, and their outcomes in economic, environmental, and nutrition terms are complex and very, and also multifaceted. So to better understand the impact of this support reallocation, we analyzed a variety of indicators measuring food security, nutrition, and climate outcomes using a global CGE model called MiragroDev. And we also did 4 scenarios. We examined the impact of a variety of approaches to reallocating along 2 axes. One was the redistribution of the support among products at the national level, and the other one at the global level. So what we did was to eliminate all market distorting support to farmers uniformly, so that all receive the same level of support, and examining both current support reallocation and increasing the support rate from low and middle income countries in the future. So what it shows this figure is the level of subsidies projected for agricultural value added in 2035, that was the period we analyzed, under the scenarios. Again, analyzed global, and then Latin America and the Caribbean, that was the concentration for this publication. And we find some messages The first one was reducing and eliminating trade distorting domestic support. It is a crucial step in this process. The scenario analysis covering support redistribution and attention to environmental impacts highlights the potential for positive outcomes, especially for low and middle income countries. However, the complexity of global agricultural demands requires careful considerations for unintended consequences, so that there is a need to really have a holistic approach, prioritizing sustainability and inclusivity. And then the second one is that as countries consider policy reform, there is a need to balance the interests of diverse economies, considering the unique needs for small farmers and also fostering international cooperation, so that the reallocation of financial resources along with targeted investment in sustainable practices emerges as a key strategy to achieve a fairer and more resilient global food system. And then the last one is that really multilateralism provides the framework to coordinate these efforts, ensuring that policy reforms transcend national borders and address global challenges collaboratively. And then the last thing I want just to highlight from this is that there were two main observations that we found. And the first one is that the topics that deal with issues that have been at the center of the traditional WTO agenda have been on the negotiation table for many years with little or no progress inside, so that there is the new, and furthermore, the new geopolitical events have exacerbated these disagreements and differences regarding the perspectives and needs of countries with different economic and trade interests, so that there's really different negotiating positions. And then the second observation is that we really need to focus on new issues related to the intersection or this nexus of environmental and climate change issues with trade standards. These topics have not been yet been fully integrated into the WTO agenda, and the main challenge lies in the lack of global governance mechanisms to define and implement rules and standards for these global problems. So in conclusion, we think that for Latin America and the Caribbean, but as well, maybe we can expand that to other developing countries, we need the full incorporation into the WTO agenda of the definition of environmental standards and norms affecting trade. We also need incorporation into the WTO of the definition of standards and norms related to human nutrition. Sanitary and phytosanitary standards have been incorporated, so it's doing kind of following the same approach of that. And then again, the plurilateral agreements that could provide flexibility for a group of countries with common interests to make special agreements to facilitate trade among them. And I know I'm running out of time, but I also would like to highlight in terms of this, how we can move forward and collaborate between all of us. I just want to highlight the work that has been done under the think tank, the T20 this year for the G20 Brazil presidency, that we have Task Force 4 that it is related with trade and investment for sustainable and inclusive growth. And we have 6 subgroups inside this task force, in which I think that the first 2 are the ones that I really want to highlight. So for this year, it was clear that the Brazil presidency pay a lot of attention to what it means about poverty and hunger, and also food security and climate action. So the topics are there, the things are there, the interest is there. So how can we also create more track in moving forward? And I think that just to end, I want to highlight, so what we were discussing in this task force 4, and I can divide it into these 3 things. So we have a new word, actually world, no word, sorry, it's a typo there in the slide. But what it is, we have a new world. We are different. We have changes in the economic, the environmental, and the technological environment. So how we can see that? We see that trade can be really favor and contribute to inequality and hunger. And then we are also highlighting in this task force the central role that the WTO can have on this. And thank you very much. I hope I didn't rush too much, but I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Thanks very much indeed, Valeria. That was also very, very interesting. And thanks very much also for giving us a bit of an insight into the T20 process this year. That's something that's very useful as well. Well, I think we've had this initial round of presentations. I'd remind everybody that please, you can ask a question either in the chat or raise your hand and make a comment at any time. Personally, I kind of drew a conclusion that there were a lot of similarities between what the speakers said, as well as some differences. But one of the things that seemed to come through was the need for the WTO to respond a bit more to the environmental and sustainability agenda. I think all of our speakers mentioned that. So that was very interesting. And also I sensed a little bit of frustration that the WTO has been talking endlessly, I think, as Evan put it, about many of these subjects, but without making enough progress. And I think Evan mentioned the need to, if possible, recenter the negotiations and try a more cross-cutting approach. Although he did emphasize that he wasn't suggesting that the original mandate needed to be rewritten, that it had to be as part of the ongoing conversations as well. I know that the negotiators have ventured into the area of sustainability, environmental considerations in their ongoing discussions, but currently we still do seem to be stuck in the same silos as we've had in the past. Evan, would you like to say a little bit more about that question of recentering and how that might be gone about?
Thanks for putting me on the spot, Stuart. I thought I was going to get away with being comfortingly vague. I mean, I don't really have a lot more to add because, of course, it's for those who are still active to sort out how to actually do that. But I do think that an obvious point to start perhaps is with, as you mentioned, and everyone else has, Valeria underlined it very well, the concept of sustainability in all its broadest sense. And that, of course, includes a whole lot of other things. It includes the food security issue. It includes the response to climate change. And I do think if the negotiators, and I do believe the mandates are sufficiently elastic to permit this, I think there is enough scope there for creativity. And I think if the negotiators were able to try and take a horizontal look at the negotiations as we have them at the moment and see what elements across the subjects could be combined, added to, amplified in a way which would do a better job of responding to the concerns that we have right now about sustainability. So I suppose it's a call for more work by the negotiators. Sorry about that, guys. But also it's a work in which I think there could be some valuable inputs from organizations and people outside the WTO. And we've just seen today with Carmel's input, with Valeria's input, that the WTO and its inhabitants don't have a monopoly on thinking or a monopoly on ideas. And some of the best things that the WTO's done have been when it's drawn upon work that's been done or started elsewhere. The classic case, which Carmel was closely involved with, and so was I once, is the way we borrowed the excellent OECD work on PSH, which also Stefan Tangeman and others were instrumental in, and it became the basis of what ended up as being the AMS in the WTO. People may not all regard the AMS as an unmixed blessing, but it was the best tool we've found yet for measuring support in agriculture, and it helped get the Uruguay round negotiations going. So I think the WTO, part of the message also is, as well as taking a more horizontal look at its own negotiating agenda, its own negotiating toolkit, the WTO shouldn't be too proud to invite thinking from outside the organization and make use of it as much as it can, because, you know, we're obviously in the market for ideas, and it would be a bad thing if the WTO of all organizations put up trade barriers to ideas. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Evan. And on that last point, that you're kind of echoing, I thought, Carmel's point in relation to need for perhaps a task force of experts to work further on this. So that in itself is interesting. And Carmel, could I turn to you perhaps and ask? Do you have anything further you could say on this subject of a possible task force? You were reasonably explicit actually in your original remarks, but is there anything you could add to flesh that concept out? It would be interesting. And also, I noticed that you did say in your remarks that maybe we ought to think about re-examining the proposition that you can't do domestic support outside the multilateral approach. And I thought that was a very intriguing concept, because a lot of people in the WTO, according to my recollection, think that you can only tackle subsidies multilaterally. It's really difficult to do it otherwise. So if you could expand a little bit on that possibility, I think it would be interesting for the audience as well.
So, right. On the question of the task force, you know, when my kids were in the equivalent of high school, they used to participate in something that I think was called Model UN Conventions, where they all went and they were given a label. They had to pretend to be the representative of this country or the other country and debate an important subject in international relations. In my mind, the task force is a little bit like that, where the people participating in it come with expertise, but not necessarily, you know, sitting on their positions. They're there to explore and just try to find out, you know, what would happen if, you know, a whole lot of what if statements that would be done at a fairly technical level and then brought into a different type of discussion later. Again, it might be an absolute pipe dream. But in response to something that Evan said, I think it would be quite akin to starting from scratch, because like I said in my initial remarks, the idea would be that the things they would look at would respect completely the initial architecture of the three pillars. But basically, it would start from a measure of where we are today. And so, for example, in none of the presentations I've ever made, or in the Pathways paper, or any of those things, we didn't make any proposal about, you know, baseline caps should be, or what level of what depth of cuts should be made. You know, somehow we're in waiting to see just where countries are before even venturing onto to that territory. So that's the kind of thing that I have in mind. I think there's an awful lot of information out there. There's something called the Ag Incentives Consortium, which is hosted by IFPRI, and to which the OECD, the FAO, the IED, well, the OECD and the FAO are the main ones contributing the data. IFPRI does a lot of the technical work and hosts it. The World Bank, the WTO, the IEDB are all members and active in it. You know, there's a lot of information out there, with the will to do it. I'm not sure that the incremental resources necessary would be really all that huge. On the plurilateral issue, there's a debate raging in France at the moment about something called clause miroir, or mirror clauses. And the idea is that you, in order to avoid the accusation that the playing field is not level because of measures that have been taken in pursuit of climate and environmental goals, that you need to somehow have reciprocity in that dimension. And that, of course, is very, very difficult. It's possible in some areas, and it's not at all possible in others. But could one imagine either a PTA or a plurilateral in the context of the WTO, where people would fall short of full-fledged disciplines on domestic support, but where they could agree to roll back the most environment and climate damaging measures, where they would agree on what they think are constructive, positive measures in the same realm, and agree that, you know, between them, they would all endeavour to implement those measures. You could start with small steps in that respect, but I do have a bigger thought about whether it's really, maybe you can't do subsidies multilaterally, but does it matter? Because countries have always made unilateral reforms, and they're making unilateral reforms today, very often in respect of climate and environment issues. So why not just bank those reforms that countries are making, and bind them within a coalition of the willing? So maybe it's bonkers, but that's what I've been thinking.
Thanks very much, Carmel. Yeah, that's an interesting thought, and it kind of plays into the very live debate in the WTO about plurilateral agreements and that sort of thing. As you say, it would be presumably a coalition of the willing if you were to go down that route, which might have limited value to start with, but could set perhaps a precedent for the future. But I mean, the whole area of plurilateral agreements is very much up in the air in the WTO. So we'll have to see where that leads. Well, the floor is still open for anybody who would like to ask a question. Nobody's jumped in yet, so I presume you're all fascinated by what the panelists are saying. But I do hope that you don't feel inhibited from asking questions. So please feel free. Evan, coming back to you, I mean, you mentioned also the lack of linkages, which might be holding agriculture back at present. And as we both said at the outset, of course, the original stimulus for the Doha round was really the fact that agriculture needed a broader context to provide trade-offs. It didn't work. So, I mean, are you thinking that there needs to be another round now, or you know, how would you approach that particular problem?
Hell no. I think you know, I think the chances and the desirability of pushing for another round pretty slim, and I certainly wouldn't want to advocate for that. And unless it's some very different concept of a round, I mean, but certainly the sort of traditional great big throw everything in and see what comes out kind of round is, I think, a concept that has probably had its day, and is, I would argue, more trouble than it's worth. I think, but that does leave us with the problem, as I said, of finding the sort of synergies and trade-offs and positive linkages that can help get controversial items like agriculture, not only agriculture, over the line. But I mean, the three of us have been suggesting some possible avenues. No doubt there's others. I think this is where we all have to get a bit creative, because I think the one big wave that we can all surf in on is not coming back.
Thanks, Evan. Stefan Engerman, I see you've got your hand up. It's great to see you, Stefan. Thanks very much for tuning in, and please take the floor. Yep, you have the floor now.
Yeah, let me make an attempt at throwing a somewhat different thought into the discussion, and it has to do with the question of why was the world able to make a huge leap forward in the Uruguay round as far as agriculture is concerned. Why is that not the case now? And let me make two suggestions in that regard. One thing that existed at the time of the Uruguay round was fundamental agreement on what the major problem was. The major problem at the time were all these massive distortions in agriculture, stemming from domestic support, stemming from high trade barriers and export subsidies. So it was pretty clear what one was aiming at solving. It was the distortions problem that one was trying to solve. And secondly, it was clear at the time who were the major antagonists. And it was, like was suggested earlier, the United States on the one hand, plus a few other countries interested in more free trade, in particular the Cairns Group. On the other hand, the European Union. And in the end, the result was that the EU and the US came together to solve that massive problem of distortions, the Blair House thing that was mentioned already. Against that background, I have the impression that it's not clear now what the major problem really is. Distortions, yes, they do still exist, but to a far lesser extent than what was the case before the Uruguay round. As a result, in part of the Uruguay round, but in part also of unilateral reforms, much of the high support and protection levels have been significantly reduced. Yes, a few new ones are arising or have come into existence, but the picture is not as bleak as it was as far as distortions are concerned at the time of the Uruguay round. On the other hand, the major antagonists, that's a completely different set of countries now, which in part has to do with the changing geopolitical scenery. To be naive, coming back to Carmel's point, it's on the one hand the India versus the Western countries. The issue there is mainly PSH. But PSH overall is not really the big problem that the world is trying to solve now. Now, what is the major problem the world is trying to solve? It's really, like was suggested a number of times now, the sustainability issue plus food security. So why not indeed, in a way, and I know this is a pretty extreme suggestion, forget at least for a while about trying to further reduce support and protection, because after all, it's no longer quite that bad, and sit down over matters such as sustainability. And in a way, it comes back to what even saying, let's try a totally different approach. Look at horizontal matters, and perhaps one can indeed, taking that suggestion, plus Carmel's suggestion that a few of the things that were agreed in the way round do not help in terms of making progress towards sustainability. Now sit down and see, can one not agree on a number of things that can help countries when they try to improve sustainability, and do a bit of the incremental convergence that even has suggested in an area that is in a way different from the Article 20 type negotiations, but try and find at least some sort of agreement on some matters, even though they are no longer of the traditional nature, to see that countries can still find some form of agreement on at least some matters to show it's not all a bleak picture. Sorry for having spoken so long.
That's fine, Stefan. Thank you very much indeed. That's a very interesting thought. So basically, you're saying, if I understood you correctly, that there's not a sufficient level of unhappiness now as regards support and protection, and that we need to refocus. And as you said, all of our speakers kind of did say that we need to look more at the sustainability and food security side of the equation as well. So thanks a lot for that. And Edwini, how lovely to see you as well. Thanks also to you for joining in, and I'll give you the floor.
Thank you, Stuart, and I must commend all the panelists for very good presentations. Well, I'll be speaking from my perspective as the director of the Agriculture Division, and I do agree with Evan wholeheartedly, completely, that we need to have fresh thinking. And I think, at least from the Secretariat point of view, we are not opposed to that. In fact, we have been organizing thematic sessions, and the whole idea was to help the members to deepen their understanding on issues such as climate change, food security, to enable them to make informed decisions. So I think we have tried to inject sustainability in the negotiations, but the view has also been expressed that we already have very, great difficulties. As exemplified, we have not reached a decision on agriculture, I think, since 2017 in Buenos Aires. So if we are to inject sustainability, it would actually make matters worse. In fact, we did a seminar where we basically focused on sustainability. I think it was last year or 2 years ago. And it was quite clear the impact of the agricultural sector on the environment and vice versa. So it is kind of a no-brainer that sustainability has to be addressed. But the members have different views. On food security, some members think food security is only public stockholding. Others disagree. On sustainability, others think it is only climate change, which others also disagree. Like Evan said, we need to consider the three aspects of sustainability. So I think we need to have a fresh thinking, but what's the starting point? It is quite true that there is a widening gap in the positions of exporting countries and countries with growing populations who think that WTO rules actually inhibit them from attaining food security. They question the de minimis, that 10% may be too low. with, the increasing population and others. So I think we need to have that thinking. A lot of thinking has gone on, I think, outside of the WTO and inside of the WTO, but regrettably, we haven't found a way to inject that into the negotiations. So I think going forward, we need to see how we can leverage, work done by think tanks and others, and also related, I think at the end of the day, for us to make progress, we need to take into account the practical realities. It is very different, to have theory or to have academic studies which may not actually reflect things on the ground. So I think we need to have a bit of both. And certainly we would be from the Secretariat point of view, we would try to have as much, seminars and others, which we believe would help us to, break obviously it has been too long, since 2000 and there hasn't been progress. And sometimes, it looks like it can never be resolved. But I think with the will and creativity, we should be able to make progress. And it is difficult, certainly no doubt, as exemplified by Evan, because there are no trade-offs. It's very difficult to tell countries which want to provide support, reduce your support. What is the reason? And I think Stefan mentioned that. Countries, and even if we are talking of a coalition of the willing, that is not there. Even among exporting countries or among developed countries, there are wide differences. Some developed countries, the Kens may want to reduce support, others may not want to do that. So it's very difficult. So I think we need to really brainstorm, set out the parameters, and find something which each and every country can feel comfortable with. And I think that is the task. Otherwise, I think it would, it will not get any tangible results. So I think that is the tax. And I think from the Secretariat point of view, I think we are very determined to work closely with members as well as think tanks and experienced people like you to see how going forward we would be able to craft a framework which will take into account all the different interests so as to strengthen the sector, agricultural sector. It has a lot of problems, and we need to make sure that we are able to respond to the growing challenges. So I think I'll just stop here.
Thanks, a huge amount there, Edwini. That's marvelous, and you're kind of telling us very clearly we need to keep our feet on the ground, and that it's hugely complicated, which I know absolutely to be the case in terms of translating discussion about concepts such as sustainability, food security, into concrete commitments in the WTO. It's a massive challenge. So thank you very much for that. Valeria, can I come back to you? You've got your hand up anyway, but I was going to come back to you also to ask if you could say a few more words about the very sensitive subject of public stock holding. I think you had mentioned that in your original I wonder if I was just going to ask that participant to mute themselves. Thank you very much. I think in your initial comments, Valeria, you mentioned the relationship between the fixed external reference price for public stock holding and the AMS, and the linkage between the two. I think Carmel also in her presentation touched on public stock holding and talked about a possible exemption unless the difference between the administered price and the reference price widened to a certain extent. So Valeria, can I offer you the floor to just say a few words about that, also to raise the point that you wanted to make as well?
Thank you, Stuart. And no, I just wanted to really comment on what Edwini just mentioned, and it is true. And I think that the WTO has been the Secretariat has been very active in really trying to get all the think tanks and many other stakeholders into a live discussion and tries to move forward the topics. But I think that now we're in a very tough situation. We have many more countries We have also agricultural trade being more important for many countries. And this is a multilateralism institution, so everybody has a vote. So it's very hard to really come up with an agreement when you have many stakeholders with many different priorities. So I think that what it is clear is that no country will leave some of their policy space for no particular reason if there's nothing in exchange for. So I think that that is what, at least from our point of view, from the point of view of the researchers, is how can we create the right incentives for different groups to sit down at the same table. And I think that that's why we're trying to come up with, well, is it sustainability? Should we talk about just food security? Should we include environmental standards? How can we create that need for sitting down at the table and be able to discuss, which I think that that is one of the issues that we have right now, is that some countries are very sticking to some things and they are not willing to give away anything. So how can we create these incentives to talk? So for example, from our point of view, we have created this network of for Latin American countries with IFPRI. Some of the delegates at the WTO from Latin American countries that are here today, maybe they are part of that. And we just talk and try to create some opportunities for them to speak and to have some kind of discussion to try to see if we can move forward into agreeing on a set of things. So I think that if we can start at least trying to group countries that think alike in some of the things, maybe not everything, just some things, it could maybe help that discussion. For example, countries that do export restrictions, can maybe they be tempted to sit down with other countries that can maybe discuss some market access agreements. So can we start thinking about something? You know, I give you something, you give me something in exchange. But again, this is purely from a researcher point of view, so that has nothing to do with the policy and how they make those commitments. But I think that that's what we're trying to come up with. Create, there's a lot of numbers, there's a lot of research that has been done. So it's how can we, as Edwin mentioned, how can we take all that knowledge and put it in a way that we can create discussion and moving forward. Sorry, I went just maybe too long for that, Stuart, and I didn't answer your actual question. What I was trying to point out with that slide is, when you talked about PSH, the discussion is, should we just assign the price for just PSH, or do we have to extend it to the rest? And I think that that is the discussion that is part of what it is going on right now and how we make that difference. I think that if you touch in one side, you have to touch it everywhere else, because otherwise you will create some distortions in between. But again, that is just one technicality. And I think that Carmel has raised her hand to answer about that, and she also pointed it out. But I think that that is one of the things that it has to come through. And again, I think that there has been research done. And again, my belief is if you touch it somewhere, it has to be all over the place. Otherwise, we will create more distortions again around that. Thank you.
Valeria. Well, we're reaching the end of our allotted time now. But Carmel, a quick comment from you, and then I'll wrap up.
Okay, am I muted? No, I'm okay. On the specific, I have a long list of things that I would have liked to respond to, but I won't. On the question of the public stockholding for food security, like Valeria, I think ideally the solution should be across the board. And I think the solution would come from the simple, but not so simple, solution of adopting current market prices. But Valeria raised a very interesting question when she opposed the idea of a technical solution with, whether in fact conceptually or substantively we should accord exemptions because it is because it is stockholding for food security. It occurs to me, and if I'm wrong, somebody will correct me. I think there's a discussion to be had there, but in reality, if you were to do what I'm suggesting and what an awful lot of other people have suggested, the issue really wouldn't arise, because I think there's, to my knowledge, no country currently operating a public stockholding scheme for food security who would be caught, as it were, in a discipline that was based off current international market prices. So I think in just practical, pragmatic terms, the issue wouldn't arise and we wouldn't need to worry about it. Other than that, I wanted to respond to Stefan. If I may, just in 1 minute. We almost never disagree about anything, and I don't really disagree with anything that Stefan said, but we have seen a phenomenon whereby, as the sort of original group of protagonists brought their support and protection down, that a group of emerging economies have tended to ramp theirs up. And when they do ramp it up, and those, you know, line graphs have kind of crossed at some point. And when they do ramp it up, it tends to be of the types of interventions that are both environmentally and climate damaging and of the most trade distorting part. And again, just to remind, and maybe we should have a discussion about that, it's my firm conviction that the agenda to fix the remaining or the new production and trade distortions overlaps hugely with an agenda that would go in the direction of improved climate and environmental performance for agricultural policies, and so that there's no necessary contradiction between those things. Other than that, thanks to Edwini for bringing us back a little bit to reality. We all, I think, understand that very well. And, you know, I, for one, am a great admirer of the WTO Secretariat and their capacity to keep on going and to keep facilitating discussions when sometimes, you know, the odds seem to be against getting anybody to. On that note, I wanted to suggest that for future meetings of this group, that maybe you should create a provision whereby people could make a comment anonymously, because I think it's sometimes very difficult for people wearing their delegation hats to be able to say what they would really like to say. So that's my last suggestion.
Yeah, I think you're right there, Carmel. Of course, it's very difficult for people to talk freely in a forum like this. But I hope anyway that the participants in the audience have got something out of it. I mean, it was a genuine attempt by all of us, especially the panelists, to respond to the appeal from the chairman for fresh thinking, and I think we got fresh thinking. So thanks very much indeed to Evan, to Carmel, and to Valeria for tremendous contributions in that respect. Very difficult to sum up the discussion, but I think my general sense is that there's, you know, outside the WTO, there's and inside the WTO, I'm sure as well, there's quite a lot of frustration with the kind of rather repetitive discussions that we seem to have, and sometimes they appear from the outside to be rather process oriented rather than delving deeply into the substance. I know that's an unfair comment in a way, because substance and process are so closely related in any case, and we're talking about a negotiation rather than a seminar in the WTO, so it is different, and we have to recognize that. But I think there's a level of frustration all around. That's one point. The second point is that agriculture is a hugely important topic for the WTO. I think it was Evan who said that, in fact, it's the only forum that's really negotiating in this area, so that we're relying on it, and it's crucial to the credibility of the WTO that we we should eventually manage to produce some further results in this area. So we can only say, Edwini, to you and your team, well done, keep going, and to your, all of the delegates as well, please keep trying in this area to produce something. And then the third and final point clearly is, I must mention, the emphasis on sustainability that we've had from, I think, just about everybody who's spoken. We understand from Edwini that the Secretariat is also involved in this, and the members are discussing the subject thematically. But clearly, and food security as well. These are two enormous areas. Carmel warned us that we're running a risk by not addressing these subjects very clearly. So I hope that you've all got something out of it, and thanks very much to everybody for tuning in, and big thanks particularly to Evan, to Carmel, and Valeria, and thank you very much indeed. There will be a video put on the website in due course if you would like to delve back into the discussion. And I hope you'll stay with the Friends of Multilateralism Group for our forthcoming events as well. Thank you very much, and goodbye.